Hello, I'm Beth Britton. I support Dementia Community with their communications work. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the second in our autumn series of webinars. Before we get into the topic for today, I just wanted to briefly explain a bit more about Dementia Community. Dementia Community is a charitable community benefit society, a membership cooperative that provides learning and networking opportunities for the dementia care community. We are an independent voice and inclusive organisation aiming to help all of our members feel connected, informed, inspired, empowered, purposeful and engaged in co-produced changes that improve everyone's experiences of dementia, both in care and in wider society. This webinar is just one example of the many ways in which we do this. Community members own a £1 community share in Dementia Community, and membership is open to everyone. So if you aren't already a member, do join us. There are both benefits and opportunities for all of our members. My colleague Beth Lang will put a link in the chat that will take you to our membership page. If you're having any difficulties in joining, do message either myself or Beth in the chat and we will endeavour to help you. So, on to the topic for today's webinar. Our topic today is, can the NHS prevent dementia? A very intriguing question, which we're going to hopefully find out the answer to shortly. Before we do, just a little bit of brief housekeeping. So we are recording this webinar. So if you don't want your face on the recording, please turn your camera off. Please use the chat for your questions. We will have a Q&A and discussion after the presentation, and we'll be keeping an eye on the chat. We hope to have some live participation too. So if you'd like to ask your question yourself, please raise your hand when we get to the Q&A. Afterwards, Beth Lang will email you the slides, and the recording will also go onto our YouTube channel, the Journal of Dementia Care. So do look out for that. We will also send you a feedback form afterwards, and we'd be really grateful if you could complete that and return it to us. So let's get started. Our speaker for today is Vanessa Raymont, who is an Associate Professor and Old Age Psychiatrist at the University of Oxford and Oxford Health NHS Foundation Trust, and Associate Director of Dementias Platform UK. Vanessa, welcome, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Beth, and thanks for that lovely introduction and for having me here. And I'm going to go ahead and share my slides, so hopefully this will work for everybody. And again, I'm assuming everybody can see that. Do tell me if you cannot. Great. Okay, so yeah, it's a big topic. Can the NHS prevent dementia? Lots to cover. I've been working in different times as an old age psychiatrist and in research in old age psychiatry and dementia for about 30 years now. And a huge amount has changed. And I think I can safely say that we haven't been in such an exciting, potentially exciting time in terms of treatments, management, how we manage risk, etc., around dementias for decades. Obviously, this is a massively important topic, and it would be an oversimplification if I was going to give you the answer, frankly, of whether we can prevent dementia in 1 hour. But I think we are getting closer towards it, and that's an absolutely massive possibility. So I'm just going to hopefully give you a little bit of flavour of some of the things that are going on at the moment, which some of you will have heard in the news, but maybe some things you won't have done. And then, yeah, I think very much I'd welcome questions at the end. I'm going to particularly focus on what's happening in research, but also what's happening in services, because ultimately it's all well and good if we're doing lots of things, I think, in research, but if it's not filtering through to real people on the ground, then there's not a huge point. So I'm going to start off with a few statistics, again, which I'm sure are really familiar to all of you. Dementia, I think it's safe to say, is really one of the greatest global health challenges that we're dealing with currently. And again, I'm sure you're all very aware that it affects close to 1 million people in the UK, and that's just people with dementia. So that may not include people with milder memory impairment, and also the people who don't have a diagnosis. And it's estimated it affects 50 million people worldwide, and that is forecast to triple by 2050. So although we are seeing some elements of risks for developing dementia being addressed, so those numbers are going down, some other risk factors are going up. And so overall, we're still looking at an increase in numbers. And what this means is that probably close to 25 million people in the UK now have a family member or friend living with dementia, which is really just massive. This means that this set of disorders now really affects all of us. However, as well as new treatments, there is a lot of growing evidence for risk factors, genetic, clinical, so other medical conditions that increase your risk, environmental factors and lifestyle factors that could be preventable and therefore could help reduce the number of people that go on to develop dementia. So there's a much greater emphasis in research on prevention and moving those prevention strategies and treatments earlier and earlier in the pathway. So there's a lot on this slide, and I would just draw your eye to the diagram on the right-hand side. This is from something called a Lancet Commission paper. This was first published back in 2020, and then it was updated a couple of years later, and there was a further update this year. And I don't know how well you can see the details on this slide, but basically those different percentage points are the amount of dementias that we think could be prevented if you could manage these individual risk factors better. So you can see at the top, so this was by pooling research data from a whole load of studies. The biggest factor is hearing loss. If you could address that, you could be looking at preventing 77% of dementias, cholesterol, depression, traumatic brain injury, physical inactivity, diabetes, smoking, hypertension, obesity, excess alcohol use. And then what really impacts when you get older, social isolation, air pollution, and visual loss. Overall, this latest paper published just a couple of months ago suggested if we could address all of these risk factors, we could potentially prevent 45% of all dementias, which is really massive, I think. So we are at the point where risk management is possible and we know what we should be managing. The other thing is that if we are going to try and identify people to target these risk factor management at, we need to be able to identify people with diseases that lead to dementia better than we do now. And we're getting better markers of those diseases. And the other thing is modifying treatments, disease-modifying treatments are here. And a lot of you will have heard, again, in the last couple of months, a drug called lecanemab was approved in the UK for use, but it was not approved by NICE, so it's not available on the NHS at the moment. But those drugs are coming, and there are more in the pipeline. So I think all of this together also means that the public expectation is starting to shift. And whereas if you went back 5 years, certainly 10 years or more ago, I think people saw dementia as something that there wasn't an awful lot you could do about. Maybe it didn't matter if you had a diagnosis because there wasn't a lot that could be done. And certainly the prospect of preventing it seemed like something that wasn't feasible. So things are evolving, things are shifting. And therefore, I think we are at the point where we could see ultimately prevention happening. And part of this, as I said, is about getting an earlier and more accurate diagnosis. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And things like Alzheimer's Research UK have highlighted that over the last couple of years. First of all, even if you don't have access at this moment to these new drugs or to risk management, I think having a more accurate diagnosis does mean you can have better care and support, because we are starting to realize that there are specific things that can help particular forms of dementia better than others. I think it gives you the ability to plan ahead and think, how can I improve my brain health? And I'll come on to what that could involve. And then, as I said, in time, access to appropriate treatments. The last new drug for Alzheimer's dementia, which is, as you know, the commonest cause of dementia, was back in 2005 in the UK. So we've had a huge gap. And while those drugs made a big difference, so I mean, I did my first memory clinic when the first of those drugs, donepezil, came on the market. We've had a huge gap, as I said, where nothing new's come on. And there are a lot of drugs in the pipeline now, again, as I'll evidence a little bit later. And I think finally, it just empowers people. I think most people, there will always be some people that say, I don't really want to know what's going to happen to me. But I think more people do want to know that, even if they're in the early stages, so that they can plan what they want to do in terms of other support and other treatments. So this slide is specifically focusing on Alzheimer's disease, as I said, obviously the commonest cause of dementia. And it just gives you a flavour about how complicated this disease is. So on the left, there's this busy diagram, which I don't expect you to see all the words on that, which represents all the different processes that we think go on in the brain as part of Alzheimer's disease. And on the right is a list of what happens. So changes in the proteins amyloid and tau, changes in inflammation, changes in the blood-brain barrier integrity. So that's the barrier that kind of blocks the brain from certain things that may damage it. And what has happened in the past is when we've had treatments or tried new treatments is they've tended to work on one or other of the factors in this set of processes, and that's maybe why they haven't worked. And we're now at a point where developing multiple drugs that could affect multiple processes. So this is another reason why we're closer to success. And the other thing, you may well have seen this slide before, it's a really famous slide, which demonstrates that we know that the changes that happen in the brain with Alzheimer's disease happen probably years, if not decades, before you actually develop memory symptoms. So if you can see this red line and blue line on the left-hand side of this picture, that represents changes in these proteins, amyloid and tau in the brain. And then the green line represents structure of the brain. And those happen years before you actually have memory problems and problems with your clinical functioning. And again, as some of you will know, this means we go through a phase called mild cognitive impairment before we go on to develop dementia. It's also known as the prodromal phase, and not everybody in that phase will get dementia. But we know that there's this phase of preclinical disease when people's cognition, their memory is normal, but these changes are going on in the brain without symptoms. So there are 2 points at which we could prevent things here. We could either do what's called secondary prevention in that early phase, either when your cognition is normal, when you've just got mild symptoms, or we could ultimately be looking at primary prevention to actually stop you having Alzheimer's disease in the first place. And so if you looked at these pictures of 4 people and I asked you, which of these do you think are more likely to have Alzheimer's dementia? I think it's safe to say most people would go for person D. But if we put it another way and said, which of these people do you think may have Alzheimer's disease? So be in that early stage before they start to develop symptoms. The reality is it could be any of those people. Maybe not person A, maybe we're not looking at people in their 20s, but certainly we think by your 40s and 50s, some people are starting to develop Alzheimer's disease, but they're still decades off dementia, and they may never get dementia. So how do we know who those people are? And what treatments do we need to target at those people, or risk management techniques to ensure they don't progress to the dementia stage? Now, the other thing that makes all of this more complicated is the fact that during this process, we're all getting older. And when I sit in my clinic, I often say to people, I would love if I could offer you a tablet that would stop you aging, but we don't have that. And so what this picture represents is on the left-hand side, these are all those processes that were on that busy slide that I just showed you. And then at the bottom, we've got a representation of different ages. What it's emphasizing is that some of these things are normal things that happen in the brain, like we have amyloid and tau and normal proteins in the brain. So at different ages, they also have different levels. And that interplays with what happens if you have Alzheimer's disease. So if we looked at this same kind of picture with somebody with Alzheimer's disease, all of these changes on the left are happening as the disease progresses. But as the person gets older, there's other changes going on because they are getting older. And what that means is if you're going to develop a treatment, say for amyloid, it may have to be used in the very elderly. But if you wanted a treatment that was there to prevent problems with blood vessels and amyloid, it may work best in somebody in their 50s. So it's doubly complicated because we've got a really complicated disease. And on top of that, as your brain ages, there are other things that happen. And we need to incorporate both of those things when we're planning how to prevent this. The other thing that we know, I talked a little bit about some of the risk factors, but we also know there are a lot of preventative factors, and that they also probably have maximum impact at different ages. So what this slide demonstrates is some of those risk factors on the top, and you've got your age in the middle. So we're starting to realize that some things like diabetes or changes to blood vessels, so vascular insults, things like stroke, probably have maximum effect in later life, so maybe in your 70s or beyond. But we know that there are protective factors like social activity, physical activity. What we're starting to realize again is that maybe there are particular age points at which those have the most benefit. So you can start to see that if you're going to have a risk management plan, you're going to have to adjust that through the age span. So it's not just we give you a suggestion when you're 50 or 60, and that's going to last for the rest of your life. So you can see how this gets even more complicated. But I think where we are is that we have a vision now that in the future, you will be given a probability of neurodegeneration or developing dementia, not a diagnosis, but maybe a prognosis. So how do we measure that? How do we identify people's prognosis of developing dementia? Because don't forget, again, if you think back to that slide with the curves, we're often talking about people before they start to develop significant memory problems. So how do you pick those people up? This is where it comes back to those markers I mentioned at the start, so-called biomarkers. And maybe not just cognitive decline, but subtle changes in things like memory. So the first step for preventing dementia from a secondary dementia prevention point of view is identifying the person most at risk. And so that will be about addressing their risk factors, so fixed things like their genes, because there are certain markers that we know increase your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, for instance, and the modifiable things, so things like diet, exercise, things that increase your risk of stroke. As I said, we're probably going to be wanting to look at a cognitive profile, so subtle changes in thinking abilities, not frank decline in memory problems. And the crucial thing here will be biomarkers, evidence of underlying disease. And ultimately, if we put all of these things together, maybe we can come up with a prediction score for each individual. So that's the first step. But the second step, as I said just now, really is then you have to think about how you tailor the treatment. So how do you reduce the risk factors and enhance the protective factors? And maybe there has to be specific drugs used at specific ages in order to manage, to prevent things most effectively. But then the final thing is, how do you measure success? Because if we're looking at prevention, and these are people, again, who don't have significant memory problems, to date, for most new drugs, they've been for people who have dementia or mild cognitive impairment. So you measure success by whether their memory either gets better or stops getting worse. But if you don't have a memory problem, how do we know the drug's working or the intervention's working? Well, it may be, again, these subtle cognitive changes go back to where they should be. The biomarkers will be the crucial thing that we need to measure. And ultimately, over time, do those people have a reduced rate of developing dementia? So again, just to give you a flavor of how this could work, this picture shows you maybe the kind of things you could do in a personalized prevention plan. So maybe the first step would be when you're 60, and you look at the different factors that could increase your risk of getting dementia. And so the red box there stands for lifestyle factors, the green for genetic, this person has diabetes, and then the biological factors are other things linked with their age and genes and so on. So for this particular person, maybe they're overweight and they've got uncontrolled diabetes. So the first thing you tell them is, can we offer you some advice about diet? Can we help you lose some weight? And that will help reduce your risk maybe from 73% down to, when you're 70, 51%. And part of that is also managing your diabetes better. So you can see that that diabetes risk box has shrunk. The red lifestyle box has shrunk because hopefully the person's been able to lose some weight. The genetic box is the same because that's the same through your lifespan. But the biological risk factors are now bigger because the person's getting older. But you put that all together, their risk has still shrunk by over 20%. And then maybe when you're 80, at that point, again, you reassess all these factors. Their diabetes may be a little less well controlled as they're getting older. Their biological factors have actually shrunk because at that point, maybe they're over the peak of developing dementia. And maybe at that point, you need to use targeted drug therapy. But overall, you still managed to shrink their overall risk to 40%. So that's a kind of sense of how it could work. But I'm going to talk a little bit about biomarkers and where we are with that, because that's one of the big changes that's come about in the last few years. So just to be clear what a biomarker is, it's some kind of molecular or biochemical change. So a change within a structure in the brain or elsewhere in the body that we can accurately and repeatedly measure and can be used to identify and monitor changes in pathology, changes in disease, or response to interventions. And there are different biomarkers that you may be better at detecting disease or measuring response to treatment or staging how bad your disease is, and so on. This really complex side just demonstrates the pathway of where we've come to with biomarkers. So if you go back to the 1990s, that was around the time where we really started measuring things like amyloid and tau, those key changes in Alzheimer's disease, in the CSF, in the cerebral spinal fluid. So this is the fluid that sits in our spinal cord, bathes our brain, and we can measure through doing a lumbar puncture, putting a little needle into the base of the spine. And at that point, we started to be able to measure amyloid and tau. And then in the early 2000s, there was a lot of people put all the information together and worked out that there were three key aspects we needed to measure in Alzheimer's disease. One was indeed amyloid, one was tau, and the other one was neurodegeneration. So the amount that the brain was responding to these things and how much brain cells were being damaged in effect. And so we ended up with this A, T, and N that we needed to be able to measure. What's really happened over the last kind of 5-6 years is the development of blood biomarkers. And you can see some of them named there in that gray box on the right-hand side. And the key thing that's changing now is that we have some blood tests that seem to be as good as things like lumbar punctures and PET scans, which is how we used to measure things like amyloid and tau. And we're also at the point where some of these seem to predict cognitive change over time. And some of you will have seen there was a lot of news around April time about some new studies that were going to trial blood tests for Alzheimer's and other causes of dementia. And there's a couple of studies, and I'm involved in one that's going to be starting in the next few months that's doing that. And again, we already know a lot about these blood tests and they do seem to work effectively, but there are some gaps in what we know. So there's more work to do before they can be completely rolled out in the NHS, but we're very close. Now, I've talked a little bit about blood and CSF and why those have been important for measuring early Alzheimer's disease, but there are other biomarkers. And the other big development area is around what we call digital biomarkers. And so these are devices that can measure different aspects of disease. And they can either be active or passive. So active digital biomarkers are things like games that you play on a phone or on a tablet or a computer, and they can measure cognitive abilities through the games. There's also development of things like speech biomarkers. So people have realized that there are certain changes in our speech that seem to be early markers of Alzheimer's disease. Or things like EEG, and this was historically a test you'd have done in hospital to look at the electrical changes in the brain. And on the bottom right, you can see somebody wearing a bit of kit that is now able to be rolled out for people at home, even, that can do the same thing. And then the passive markers are things like smartwatches, those types of devices that can measure how well you sleep, how you walk, your gait. Because again, there's emphasis in research, or there's evidence in research that even things like gait may change early on in Alzheimer's disease. So these could be really useful because if they're just devices you can use at home and you don't need to go into a clinic and do a blood test, you know, the prospect of gathering a lot of data from people, you know, them not being nervous or tired, having to go to a clinic is massive. And maybe it presents the opportunity of almost creating what I'd call virtual clinics. So this idea that you may have a device that measures things like your memory or your gait. And if that seems to be varying from the norm, maybe it will prompt you to go and have an appointment with your GP. But there are still issues. Obviously, the more tech we use, people get concerned about their data and how that's shared and privacy. And also, not everybody can use all the bits of kit that are available. So how user-friendly are they? How accessible are they? And how reliable are they? If your Wi-Fi goes down, can you still use them? But certainly, even in the last few years, there's been some evidence, and I've noted here, that if you put, say, a memory test and a blood-based biomarker together in primary care with GPs, that seems to improve the referral pathway and waiting times for memory clinics. So I have no doubt that we'll be using more of these in the future. So to summarize about biomarkers, they're becoming much more accessible, much more useful, but we do need to think more. We need to think how and when they're used and how often. Which tests do we use for people with symptoms and without symptoms? And if you start wearing a device that picks up change of your gait, say, and tells you maybe you're more at risk of Alzheimer's disease, do people want to know that? And who do you disclose that information to? And how do you disclose that information? And do you put it on their medical records? You know, certainly in the US, there's a lot of concern that if you do have that stuff on your medical records, it may affect your ability to get health insurance. So there is some more to be thinking in this area. And then there are other biomarkers I haven't talked about. So genetics, as I said, there are some markers we know are useful for detecting Alzheimer's disease, or risk of Alzheimer's disease rather. And brain scans I haven't talked too much about. But this is the but. We're still lacking a lot of data in certain groups, and that includes the elderly, people who are more at risk and middle-aged, what I would say are diverse populations, so people in certain ethnic groups, people in certain socioeconomic groups, more rural populations, and people with other health problems like heart disease or kidney disease. And finally, we may need a panel of biomarkers. It's probably not likely that one blood test or one test will give you a reading of all of your risks through your whole life in terms of developing dementia. It's probably going to be about a few different tests together, or maybe at different ages that we need to use. So I'm now going to talk just briefly about where we are with drugs and new treatments. So in terms of drug treatments for Alzheimer's disease, this is really the three key areas that have been focused on over the last few years. So can we develop new drugs to address the amyloid plaques and the tau tangles, the two key pathological changes in the brain that we see in Alzheimer's disease? And can we do something about the inflammation that you get in the brain as a response to amyloid? As I mentioned earlier on, we haven't had a new drug in the market in the UK or elsewhere, to be frank, for over 20 years. And 90% of the trials that we've done between then and now have failed for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons is that we think we're probably not recruiting the right people. And that, again, coming back to those points I made earlier about certain people at certain ages having different patterns of change in their brain means including everybody in a trial means you don't know more accurately who's going to respond to the drug. So we've just recruited too broad a group. And we've probably done these trials for too short a time. And we're not measuring the right thing in terms of whether the drug's working or not. What this slide shows you is where we are with new trials. And I think you can see, so this is from a paper that comes out every year that's published to tell you all the new drug trials that are working in the dementia space. And this has been going for several years. And if you look back a few years ago, these circles were much less busy. And now you can see there are lots and lots and lots of drugs in different phases of clinical trial development. And certainly over the last 5 years, we've seen a greater range of drugs. So again, not just targeting amyloid or tau, but again, all those pathological processes I showed you on one of those first slides. There are more repurposed drugs. So we're starting to look at other drugs that we use for things like diabetes. Would they actually be useful for Alzheimer's dementia? Certainly, we're starting to look in the more mild stages, more at the MCI, mild cognitive impairment, or even before people develop memory problems. And again, we're starting to realize we're probably going to need combinations. Again, this is not about one drug that will prevent all types of dementia in everybody throughout their life. Probably we're going to be needing to look at combinations. And so just a little update, lecanemab is the drug that was in the news over the last month or so, the first disease-modifying drug for Alzheimer's disease that has been approved in many countries now across the world. was approved here as well. It's amongst one of the first what we call disease-modifying drugs, so it really seems to have long-term changes to the pathology in the brain. What we found in the trials is it does reduce significantly levels of amyloid. That's what it's designed to do. And it seems to have a 27% slowing of memory impairment as a result, and creates a slow decline of quality of life. What the company has said is this roughly equates to maybe 5 months of extra time before you reach the same cognitive point. So in effect, you get 5 extra months before your memory declines to the same point it would have done, which is not a lot, but it's a first step. And as I said, it was approved by MHRA in this country in August. NICE did not approve, but there are other drugs in the pipeline, and some things may come back for review. Donanemab is the next one that's just been recently approved in the US and is currently under consideration. And that particularly is looking at trials for primary prevention. And again, this is a really busy slide, but this is from various trials that are looking at those drugs that are kind of coming close to being approved. What this seems to demonstrate is that all of these drugs need to remove things like amyloid at a certain rate and degree, and that's why they work where other drugs didn't in the past. And you only seem to get clinical benefit when enough amyloid has been removed for long enough. What we don't know at this point is what happens when you stop the drugs. So do you need to keep taking these drugs for forever? Or if, say, you take them for a couple of years or 3 years, is that going to be enough? And of course, this work is crucial because if you're talking about implementing all these drugs across all those number of people that could develop dementia, that's a massive cost and practical thing that's needed in the NHS. But if you only need to take the drug for a couple of years, that's much more doable. And then other drugs in the pipeline, as I mentioned, are looking at things like tau. That drugs that attack tau, this protein that also is affected in Alzheimer's disease, seem to have a better correlation with memory. So if you target tau, they seem to have much better impact on memory. So a lot of those drugs are in development. People looking at gene therapy to help reduce the production of amyloid and tau in the first place seem to be very promising. And then drugs that look at that inflammation piece are also in development. But for the last few minutes, I'm going to move on to where we are with services, because as I said, all of this is well and good. We can detect disease earlier, we can detect it more accurately. We seem to have drugs in the pipeline that could treat it, but can the NHS actually deliver all this? Well, there was a study published some years ago now, you can see here, that looked at 6 countries and how prepared they were to deliver these types of treatments. So you can see there, it was France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Sweden, and the UK. And this was from 2018. And what they looked at was if the drugs were licensed in 2020, how soon could the health services respond and how quickly could they get through the waiting lists? And what they estimated was the first year that healthcare systems would not have a waiting list, so if you look at the UK, would be 2042. So in other words, it would take over 20 years to clear the waiting lists. And the reason for that was they did base this on drugs that were given by intravenous infusion, and lecanemab is one of those drugs. But there are drugs in the pipeline where you can give them in more simple ways. So that would make one of these things simpler. The other rate limiting step in most countries was the number of specialists, so the number of memory clinics, and the number of places memory clinics in. So not only do you have the doctors and the nurses to deliver the drugs, but do you have the facilities, the clinic space? And that was an issue in most of the countries. And similar information was pulled from other countries like the US. So they found 15 million people were estimated to be in the US with mild cognitive impairment that even needed evaluation in the first place. And that equated to maybe 50 months wait for a specialist in this scenario. And others have found similar prospects in Canada and Japan. And that's aside when you think about, even if you manage a waiting list, there's going to be other people coming along into that waiting list with mild cognitive impairment and early problems to just keep filling the gaps. It's a huge issue as to how we manage this in healthcare services. So It's a bit difficult to read the details on this slide, but what we're starting to do is to think, how do we redesign healthcare systems to manage all of this much better? And this slide demonstrates maybe what a memory clinic could be doing in the future. So for those of you who maybe you've been to a memory clinic, you'll recognize that you get referred by your GP and you come, you do some memory tests, you maybe have a physical examination, you maybe have some blood tests. But now you would be talking about doing things like retinal screening, genotyping, blood tests to look at these biomarkers, may be confirmed by more specific studies like lumbar punctures and PET scans in some people. And then you'd have a range of treatments like disease-modifying drugs, donepezil that's already available, and other drugs. And again, that seems like a lot of extra work and a lot of extra money, but actually this is where blood and digital tests could be really useful, because we're also at the point maybe where some of these blood tests could be done by sending you a card through the post, and you just prick your finger like you do for tests for diabetes. And again, so that could be much easier to deliver. And if we could measure your memory through a thing on your phone or some other device that you can use at home, that makes it much easier to roll this out. So the challenges really are, how do we roll the services out to deliver these drugs and interventions better? Do we use things like digital devices and bloods, and where do they sit? I said telehealth. This is the idea that, do we need these virtual clinics where doctors may see you online, or maybe you get referred into clinics when these devices highlight a problem? You know, we need to think outside the box for this. But as I've highlighted, we still need a lot more real world data in particular groups. And I've mentioned some of those already. And that's the thing. In order to make sure that these things work in the real world, we really need more of that information. And this slide comes from a paper that was published last year that looked at where we were with memory clinics and the need to start rolling out what was called brain health services. So this was a Europe-wide paper that said we need to be having more of a focus on brain health. So obviously we need to support people with dementia and people with mild cognitive impairment, but we also need to think, how do we help people manage all those risk factors? And what you can see in this area at the bottom of the slide is that in timelines, they estimated that we should be doing pilot brain health clinics around now up until 2025. And then this blue area of clinical deployment really should be from 2025 onwards. So that gives you an idea of where we are with the kind of planning stage and how these services are shifting. And there was another paper published back in 2017 called the Edinburgh Consensus that emphasized in the UK what we needed to be doing to shift services. And I'm afraid to say that I don't think very much has happened in between. Despite all of these changes in tools and drugs, most clinical assessments and most memory clinics have not really changed much in the last 30 years. And as a result, I would say this has limited patient access to some of these new biomarkers and potentially slows down the progression of people being able to get these new drugs and treatments. But it's not all doom and gloom. So a lot of sites across the UK have started setting up brain health clinics. And you can see there's a network here of sites across the UK that have now formed into something called the Brain Health Coalition. And these are in a range of memory clinics. So some of them sit in mental health trusts, like the one I work in. Some of them sit in neurology clinics and some in geriatric clinics. And the drivers for these clinics are all about profiling those risks I mentioned earlier on, providing more accurate diagnoses, helping people with personalized risk management, and particularly supporting people in that mild cognitive impairment group that at the moment, most services, including my own, people have a diagnosis and then they don't come back to the clinic for 12 months. And I know I will say to people, these are the things you can do to try and reduce your risk of developing dementia. But frankly, there isn't a lot of support into how you do that. And so these kind of services are trying to challenge that. And we've been supported by Alzheimer's Research UK and Alzheimer's Society in doing that. And the different centres are different around the UK. 5 of them are just highlighted here. So the one in Newport in Wales has been particularly focusing on a certain type of PET scan. The one in Scotland has been focusing on multi-site change, so changes in multiple places across Scotland. And the one in Manchester has been focusing on personalised risk management particularly. I'm going to just talk to you a little bit about what we're doing in Oxford, just again to give you a little bit of a flavour of what can happen. We set up a brain health clinic here in 2020. Claire Mackay, you can see her picture here, is the lead of this, and I'm involved, and then Lola Martos, one of my clinical colleagues, is also involved. And this is really about adding in new research assessments alongside a typical memory clinic battery of tests to more accurately identify people. And we did a pilot, first of all, where we looked at 150 people just coming through the routine memory clinic. We wanted to look at how feasible it was to do some extra tests and how acceptable this was for patients, their families, and the doctors and nurses seeing them. I'm aware of time, so I'm just going to go through these a little bit quicker, but hopefully still give you a flavour. So this is what the pathway in Oxford looks like. People come from their GP, they're referred for a CT scan, and then they come to the memory clinic for a diagnosis. And what the brain health clinic does is it diverts people at the point of referral into come and do some extra tests. So we basically ask people, would you mind coming to do some extra tests? And then they go back into the memory clinic pathway for a diagnosis. And this rather complicated slide demonstrates that what that means is that we ask people to do some extra clinical tests, which is in this report that goes into their medical records. And then we also ask if they would be willing to do some extra more research tests. So again, trying to develop better ways of making these more accurate diagnoses. And overall, what this has done, because all of this information goes to the memory clinic ahead of their appointment, is we've been able to reduce the time taken in the memory clinic in their first appointment. So potentially saving some resources and some money. And overall, we've had really good feedback. You can see some of the comments here from patients, people saying they found it a good experience, and clinicians saying, we found this extra information really, really helpful. And overall, if you look at the people coming through this pilot, we've had a really broad range of ages. So this is the diagram on the top right. But what I'll tell you is that, well, the mean age of people coming to this has been 78. The oldest person we had coming through was 101. So this just demonstrated that most people can access this kind of service. And that means most people consented to do these extra tests. So you can see that 87% were happy to do these extra assessments. And most people went on to complete the scans and the assessments and were very satisfied as a result. So again, what this means overall is we're starting to develop a clinical pathway that patients, carers, clinicians find useful, and they don't mind doing it. And this is in a representative group. So all those people that I highlighted, we lack data in, the very elderly and so on. So looking good. So what have we used this information for? So one of the key things we've done in the Brain Health Clinic is a MRI scan instead of a CT with an extra 10 minutes on the end of the scan, where we gather some more data about key areas of the brain. So the hippocampus is where memory is stored, and that's principally affected by Alzheimer's disease. And so this graph on the left-hand side, if you look at these little red dots, they represent real patients. And what it shows us is that if you compare their scan data with other scans that we pulled from a cohort called UK Biobank, their data is already falling outside the norm. So outside what we would expect based on their age. So you're starting to generate data to understand how to identify people earlier. The other thing that has come out of this is we've started to generate what we call more population norms, because things like UK Biobank have been really useful at understanding what scans should typically look like when you're 70 or 80. But what we realized is that if you're 85 or older, we actually don't have a lot of information about what a normal brain scan looks like. So we're gathering a lot more information. And again, I won't try and explain the graph on this, but as a result of these kinds of bits of information, we've also been able to demonstrate that the doctors in the memory clinics have more confidence in the diagnosis they're making, and have more confidence in specifying the type of dementia. The other thing that this clinic has been able to do, because it's done a wider range of assessments, is to highlight how many people have some of those modifiable risk factors. And so again, how do we target people for that personalized risk prevention? And what we found was that 74% of people coming through the brain health clinic had one or more potentially modifiable risk. So again, it's demonstrating there's a real need for us to do more of the risk prevention strategies. And also what these scans, again, this is a busy slide, but what it showed was we looked at certain changes in the scan that are related to the white matter bits of the brain, so a particular aspect of brain structure, and whether that could tell us who would be suitable for drugs like lecanemab. And it does. So these scans could be used to help identify people really early on in their memory clinic pathway that may benefit from these new drugs. And we found about 24% of people coming through the brain health clinic may be suitable for the new drugs. And finally, how much does this all cost? Because I said at the end of the day, unless this can be rolled out more widely, this type of service development, really it's not any use. So we've been working with some health economists in Oxford to look at the overall costs of this type of thing. And on the top of this slide, you can see that people coming through the brain health clinic, this is the cost, about £1,400 associated with the entire pathway, which sounds huge. And if you compare it to the traditional memory clinic pathway that costs about £400, sounds massive. But this is where some of those other interventions and using things like digital biomarkers could be useful, because we also found that although the memory clinic appointment in comparison cost £400, if you went through the brain health clinic pathway, it did actually reduce that cost as well. So, and the other thing is that we also found out that if you scaled this up in certain ways, we had more people coming to a clinic any one day, it will get cheaper. So once we know the baseline costs, we can think, how could we roll this out without it being massively more expensive? So overall, I think these types of services are a win-win-win. For the clinical point of view, you get better data, you have training opportunities for staff, you have increased access to trials and research. From the patient point of view, you get more thorough assessment, a more accurate diagnosis, and again, opportunities to participate in research. And again, for the research point of view, a lot more interface with studies. And from a healthcare service point of view, you're starting to embed research in services and making them hopefully better for patients. And that Brain Health Coalition, I showed you the map across the UK. We've now defined what these clinics need to do. They need to provide more early and accurate diagnosis, manage risk, help educate people and support people with managing those risks, and provide access to research. So I'm finished now. This is my last slide. So what are we doing next about all of this? Well, I think that prevention of dementia has certainly come a long way in the last 10 years, but there's still more to do. There is no doubt that how we diagnose things like Alzheimer's disease and ultimately dementia is changing, and the treatments are changing despite multiple hurdles. And that includes things like new biomarkers of the disease and the clinical services, but these present opportunities. But again, we need to think about the costs and how practical it is to implement these kinds of things. As I said, more new treatments and personalized risk management are on the way. I have no doubt that we will see much more of that in clinics over the next few years. But the reality check is we know that still about 30% of people in the UK with dementia are undiagnosed. So there's still a lot to do. This is not just about identifying people earlier and earlier in the pathway and forgetting about the people who will still go on and develop dementia. We need to address both needs, and we really need a unified approach to ensure that everybody gets better services than we have now. So that's me. I'm finished. I'm happy to take questions.
That was super, Vanessa. Thank you so much. So incredibly interesting to hear about all of the work you're doing, the data. I'm fascinated by risk factors, and I've got a couple of questions, one that's come in privately on the chat as well. But I'll just open the floor if anyone else would like to ask a question before I begin with mine. Louise. So Louise has put a question in the chat. So she says, With a background in biomedical science, I am interested in how metabolic alterations affect Alzheimer's disease and the biological mechanisms underlying its progression. The disparity between scientific advancements and available services, often due to cost, raises important questions about how broader social issues, such as poverty and access to healthcare, impact long-term health outcomes. How can we address these factors alongside prevention strategies to address risk factors and improve the long-term management of dementia?
Yeah, lots of really good points in there, and several big questions, I think. I mean, in terms of how we look at things like metabolic disease and how that affects Alzheimer's disease, I think, that very much speaks to the points I've made, that in whether you're trialing a new drug or you're trialing a new biomarker, we tend to exclude lots of people who have other things going on. So things like heart disease, kidney disease, metabolic disease. And we're realizing, and all of the trials now that we're doing for new drugs have a real heavy emphasis on recruiting people who are in those groups, frankly, that we used to always exclude. And I think we need to do more of those trials. In terms of how we make this more equitable in terms of access, absolutely. I think personally, I do memory clinics still in South Oxford. And when I look at what I am able to provide people in my clinic now compared to even 10 years ago, certainly 20, 30 years ago, it has sadly changed for the worse. I don't get to see people for very long. I tend to give them a diagnosis and most of the time send them on their way, which I don't think is what we should be doing in services. And I think it's about providing a better quality of service, but to more people. And I therefore think we have to really think carefully about from the kind of bottom up. I do hear quite a lot about new biomarkers and how we're going to implement these in centres that we know are very specialist already. And I think we need to consciously look at memory clinics that exist in more real world places and how do we improve them? Because only then will we make these kind of new initiatives accessible to all. And it's going to be a long process. It's not going to change overnight, but I think we need to do it one step at a time. And then we need to look at, as I said, maybe things that we can implement that may again be a challenge, but make some of this easier to do. So, the digital markers, can we send a blood test to you through the post? That sort of thing. How do we make this as accessible as possible?
Super. Thank you, Vanessa. I've got a couple more questions in the chat. Before I get to those, I just want to ask the question that came to me privately earlier. So, what is the mechanism of the hearing loss risk? Just social isolation or other factors?
So we think it's probably both. Part of it is the social isolation and the fact that it overlaps with the risk factor. And obviously, if you are not hearing information as well, you're not going to be able to retain it. But there is also a sense that with hearing loss, you are probably diverting brain activity to enable you to hear better that would otherwise be spent on other cognitive aspects. So, you're literally having to work harder to hear stuff than you would do if you were hearing better. So it seems to be on several levels, but, it's has such a massive effect. I mean, that's one thing I say to all patients in clinic now is if you don't do anything else in terms of managing your risks, look at your hearing. If you have a hearing aid, wear it. If you don't have a hearing aid, but you're not hearing as well, go have a hearing test. And there's been some initiatives looking at, well, if we started to test hearing and support people with that in a memory clinic, maybe that's a good idea. So you don't have to have a separate appointment. And for people that maybe haven't gone to a hearing test, they're supported to do it there and then. So yeah, we think it's several levels.
It's really interesting, isn't it, that we're very willing, it seems, to go to the opticians and get our eyes tested. I know that obviously vision loss has been something that's now come into those Lancet risk factors, but actually hearing tests, we still don't really. I mean, I've personally gone and done it. I'm quite happy to, but I know a lot of people don't. And it's freely available on the high street. It's not difficult to get hold of it, but there is a well-known optician, well, a few that do them, isn't there?
I think some of it, as you said, is access. So, used to be able to go more for NHS hearing tests in an NHS setting, and maybe people aren't, as you said, always aware. You could go, as you said, to certain well-known opticians. I think the other thing actually is maybe, lots of us wear glasses at different ages. So that's the norm. But I guess if you wear a hearing aid, maybe it's an indication that you're getting older, and lots of people don't want to be seen having a hearing aid. I don't know. I know, both my parents who had dementia didn't want to wear their hearing aids. So, I understand, but maybe it's still that accepting that this enables you to live better. It's not necessarily a sign that you're not doing things as well. It actually enables you. Maybe we need to look at it differently.
Definitely, I think we do. I think it's quite stigmatized. And while we're just on risk factors, before I get to the questions in the chat, obviously cholesterol and vision were the new ones that were added over the summer. Would you expect more? I think that the whole concept of oral health is incredibly interesting. Would you imagine dentistry might come into this at some point, oral health?
Yes, I mean, I know there's been things going on in research about certain risk factors around oral health for a while. And I think you're right. It's all about what are the opportunities to improve your brain health and reduce your risks. And if it's several factors that are quite deliverable by places we already go, like the dentist, as you said, in the same way most of us will go and have eye tests, most of us do go to the dentist. So that seems like a prime opportunity to address that risk factor that's already out there. Again, you don't need to redevelop a pathway. You just hopefully utilize dentists, although of course the issue around NHS dentists maybe is a whole other
and how
question.
You get a dentist. Yes, that's a whole other question, isn't it? And Sue's put in the chat, re-hearing loss, the NHS hearing aids are often not good enough and have to have a really good effect. You have to spend a lot. And I know my mum has, because she wears them, and she has got private ones because she just didn't get on with the NHS ones. But I thumped the drum on that because I was like, it's hearing loss, we've got to sort it.
Well, and I think stuff like that data that says how much of an effect it has on your risk of dementia is something we need to keep highlighting, because, I think probably in the NHS systems, they've just focused on what effect does it have in terms of your hearing, but actually it's not just your hearing, it's your potential to develop dementia. So, there's a lot more risks associated if you don't get a good hearing aid, frankly. So maybe we need to up our game a bit.
Maybe that's the message for everyone for today. Just go and get your hearing checked. Right, let me get to these questions in the chat, because I could talk to you for ages just about all the things I'd like to talk to you about. So Carol says, disease biomarkers and treatments you presented are focused on Alzheimer's disease. What is happening for other types of dementia, and how do we approach medical treatment when people have mixed dementia?
Yeah, again, really good question. And you're absolutely right. We do talk a lot about Alzheimer's. I think that's probably because most of the new treatments are focused on Alzheimer's. So and as I said, it's the biggest cause of dementia. So we start there first. But for the blood biomarkers particularly, there's a lot of interest in how we detect things like frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body dementia as well. So I mentioned that there's these two big projects starting over the next few months to test blood biomarkers at scale. And as I said, I'm involved in one of those, and we will be looking at Alzheimer's disease and other causes of dementia as well. It looks like the set of markers you need to detect most other causes of dementia are a little bit more tricky. So there's one blood test called p-tau217 that seems to be really good for detecting Alzheimer's disease. And so far, we haven't found one blood test that's quite as good for the other things. But again, there's lots of these new markers in development. So there's stuff going on. The mixed dementia is a good question, because again, most of those people historically have been excluded from research. And I'm seeing a lot more studies coming online now for people who have vascular dementia, because there's certainly been a gap in that for a while, and will recruit people with mixed dementia. So I think there's a growing awareness that, again, if you want to know what drugs work for, how they work in the real world, you can't exclude people with mixed dementia, because frankly, that's a big chunk of who is diagnosed. So I think it's shifting the point. I think they've just been excluded a lot, and fortunately, that's shifting.
Thank you, Vanessa. And I would just add, and I did put it in the chat earlier, we do cover a lot of studies and useful things that are happening in the dementia research world on Dementia Community News, which is freely available to everyone. So do keep an eye on that. I have reported on your work, Vanessa. It's very exciting. Another question in the chat, Lawrence Fletcher says, I work within a dementia learning team, so are always looking for opportunities for staff learning. You mentioned learning as part of the staff benefits for the more proactive approach to dementia services. Did you mean specific disease prevention training for staff being part of this?
I think so, absolutely. I think, again, if I just think, as I said, about the clinic I work in, we don't do risk management. We have a very limited time with patients, sadly. But I think, so it's a bit chicken and egg. I think we should be training people to more systematically ask about those risk factors. But then if you ask about it, I think you've got to do something about it as well. Or at least you've got to be able to point people in the right direction where they can do something about it. So there are some projects looking at things like, can we use social prescribers for supporting people with risk management? But I think you're right. The first step is educating staff about what are the key ones and how do we make sure we always ask about them in the first instance. Because I think we ask about hearing loss. I think we're pretty good on that, and probably visual loss. But I don't think we ask as much about the other things. So absolutely. Yeah, education is key, I think.
Super, thank you. And I think our last question, because we're running out of time. Barbara says, is there a strategic plan for rolling out brain health clinics to parts of the country not yet served? And how do people access the additional investigations offered by brain health clinics? Does this depend on whether memory services are engaged in local areas? I was going to ask you something very similar to this. Will this always be driven through memory clinics for people who are, already there is a concern that they may have a memory problem and or dementia? Or actually, will this one day become a routine clinic that we all attend?
Yeah, I think the first instance, it's about memory clinics. And I think that's because, as I said, I think for a lot of us who work in them, we feel that there's a lot of change that needs to happen. So if this is the way to start to look at what assessments we do, what investigations we do, that's an easier way to start because there's already a service there and staff. And so far, the brain health clinics have just appeared organically, and it's about individual clinicians or researchers having a bit of extra money. None of these are commissioned services, and said, I'm going to use that money to develop something different. Because we're now a national group, there is a push to say, how can we broaden and how can we bring people on? And I know the Manchester clinic, for instance, has been massively successful at getting some funding, and they're hearing from other sites that don't have brain health clinics saying, how did you do this? So I think there's an opportunity here to expand and be a bit more strategic. But Brain Health Scotland, I mentioned, that came into being a few years ago, and the Scottish government put money into exactly the infrastructure that you'd have brain health hubs and the general public could go and have some kind of screen. Kind of slowed down in Scotland, but it's still there. And I know the Dementia Mission, which I haven't talked about, it's a big bit of government initiative around dementia, is looking at some kind of screening program for the public, maybe. So I think that will come. But it takes a little bit more thought as to how you detect people that don't have problems at all, as I mentioned. And how do you feed back the information? What if you detect something? Can the services handle all of that extra workload? It's a bit more complicated, but I think it will happen.
That's really interesting, Vanessa. Thank you. I think we're going to have to wrap up. I just wanted to ask you, it's a bit of a cheeky personal question. Is there any particular risk factor you really focus on trying to address in your life?
Oh, goodness, that is a good question, isn't it? I think probably the kind of stress and is the stress factor one I try and reduce, because when you're in a busy job, but that can be a challenge. I should wear my glasses more. So I'm going to put my hand up and say, I'm meant to wear glasses all the time and I don't. So there you go. I should be focusing on that. So there you go. Two things. One I'm better at than the other.
I'm trying to focus on exercise. That's kind of my one. But thank you so much, Vanessa. It's been amazing to hear from you. Wonderful to hear about the work that's going on. Incredibly insightful. I think lots of takeaways for all of us, not least of which, the stuff around risk factors. So just thank you so much for your time today. It's very much appreciated. Thank you. And then just to signpost everyone to our next webinar. So it is a Dementia Community Open Space webinar that we're going to have. It's over to all of you guys to run the show, kind of. We are going to have some structure. We're going to have some interaction, but we really want to hear from the community what you need from us, what would make the difference for you. So do come along to that. It's on Tuesday, the 22nd of October from 2 till 3 p.m. And the booking is in the chat. My colleague Beth Lang has popped that there. So thank you again so much to Vanessa, and thank you to all of you for coming along, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.